Paris, 1894. A city glittering with electric light and brimming with artistic genius, yet beneath the surface, it harbored shadows that most preferred not to see. In the grand avenues and marble facades of the City of Light, death was never far away. At the Paris morgue, crowds gathered daily to gawk at corpses fished from a Seine. Medical students huddled around operating tables, watching surgeons slice into the silent flesh of the poor, the condemned, or the forgotten. For Parisians, fascination with death was nothing unusual. But among these observers of the body, there was one man whose obsession with human remains would push him beyond even the darkest curiosities of his age. He was a surgeon, a respected figure draped in the prestige of science, and yet he was secretly building a collection so grotesque that even his contemporaries would recoil in horror. A private gallery of severed heads, preserved in jars, lined up like trophies of the dead. The story begins at a time when science and superstition were strangely entangled. The late 19th century was an age of discovery, of progress, but also of dangerous ideas. Theories such as phrenology promised that the bumps and ridges of the skull could reveal a person's true nature, whether they were destined to brilliance, mediocrity, or criminality. Anthropology, criminology, and psychiatry were still in their infancy, grasping desperately for proof that human behavior could be explained by bones and flesh. Into this climate stepped a surgeon whose medical authority gave weight to ideas that today seem grotesque. He did not simply dissect the human body for knowledge. He harvested human heads, preserving them as specimens, convinced that each skull held secrets that could unlock the mysteries of morality, madness, and crime. The image is chilling. A dimly lit room, shelves lined with glass jars, each containing a human head suspended in chemical fluid. The eyes, clouded and lifeless, staring outward through distorted liquid. The flesh, pale and swollen, preserved very identities. To the keepers, they were no longer children. They were patients, subjects, or worse, specimens in a living cabinet of curiosities. The question that chills us today is simple. How could this happen? How could a city as advanced, as modern in its ambitions as London, tolerate the imprisonment of children in such a place? The answer lies in the intersection of fear, ignorance, and cruelty. In 1845, mental illness was poorly understood, wrapped in superstition and stigma. To be mad was to be cursed, dangerous, untouchable. And when that stigma was placed on a child, society recoiled not with compassion, but with rejection. Better, they thought, to hide such children away, out of sight, than to confront their suffering. Bedlam's walls became a convenient solution, its bricks mortared with shame. There is something uniquely horrifying about the image of a child within those halls. The adults of Bedlam, many of them long abandoned themselves, could at least dimly remember a life outside. But for the children, Bedlam was their only reality. Their lullabies were the howls of the insane echoing down stone corridors. Their toys were the rats that scurried across the straw. Their teachers were guards who wielded batons and physicians who viewed them as objects of study rather than human beings. Childhood, with all its innocence and wonder, was erased in the instant those doors closed behind them. For London citizens, the idea of Bedlam's spectacle became a morbid diversion. Families with coin to spare would visit the asylum, paying pennies to gawk at the lunatics as though they were animals in a zoo. Behind bars, children too were put on display, their small faces peering out, eyes wide with terror or dulled with resignation. Some laughed at them, others pitied them, but few stopped to question the morality of turning suffering into entertainment. The city, in its hunger for distraction, became complicit in the torment of its most vulnerable. And so, the story of Bedlam's children is not only one of institutional cruelty but also one of societal failure. These were not nameless ghosts, though history has done its best to erase them. They were flesh and blood, each carrying a story silenced by iron locks and the indifference of the world outside. Their cries blended into the cacophony of Bedlam, dismissed as the background noise of madness. Yet in their silence, we hear the echo of questions that haunt us still. How does a society decide who is worthy of care and who is cast aside? What does it reveal about us when children are seen not as lives to be nurtured but as burdens to be hidden? As we begin to peel back the layers of this macabre history, we are forced to confront the unsettling reality that the children trapped in Bedlam were not accidents of history. They were products of a system, of choices made by families, physicians, and governments that valued order over compassion. Their presence in that asylum reveals the darkest truths of Victorian London, truths that society tried to bury as deeply as the cries within Bedlam's walls. This is not a comfortable story, nor should it be. It is a story that forces us to look directly at the shadows of history, at the innocence lost and the horrors inflicted upon those least able to defend themselves. In telling it, we do not simply recount the past, we hold a mirror to the present, asking what cruelties still hide behind closed doors, what suffering remains unseen because it is easier to look away. Bedlam's children demand to be remembered, their voices carried forward through time, whispering a single, devastating truth. The measure of a society is found in how it treats its most vulnerable. The name Bedlam has echoed through history like a curse, its syllables dripping with images of chaos, cruelty, and despair. By 1845, when children were still being locked within its walls, the institution had already endured centuries of infamy. Its story begins far earlier, in the year 1247, when Bethlehem Royal Hospital was founded as a priory of the Order of the Star of Bethlehem. Originally intended as a place of charity and religious devotion, it slowly transformed into something far darker. By the late medieval era, it had begun housing those deemed lunatics, and from that moment onward, its fate was sealed. For centuries, Bedlam was synonymous not with care, but with misery, a repository for society's unwanted souls. The medieval and early modern eras viewed madness through a lens of fear and superstition. Those who spoke incoherently, who suffered seizures, or who simply behaved in ways that unsettled their neighbors were quickly labeled possessed or cursed. Bedlam became the dumping ground for such people, a place where they could be hidden from the city's respectable streets. The institution was not designed to heal, it was built to contain. The patients, often shackled to the walls or left to lie in their own filth, existed more as prisoners than as individuals in need of compassion. And in this environment, cruelty became routine, almost ritualized, until it was indistinguishable from the daily operations of the asylum. By the 17th century, the asylum had gained an infamous reputation not only across London but throughout Europe. Travellers spoke of Bedlam as though it were a carnival attraction, a grotesque landmark that any visitor to the city simply had to see. The public was permitted to tour the wards, paying small fees to gawk at the men and women trapped inside. Some screamed incoherently, others sat silently rocking, while a few were incited by guards for the entertainment of the crowd. To the visitors, it was shocking, even amusing, a theatre of human suffering. But to those within, it was nothing less than hell itself. And within this spectacle, even the youngest prisoners were not spared. The 18th century brought whispers of reform, though little truly changed beneath the surface. The Great Fire of 1666 and subsequent relocations did nothing to alter the asylum's fundamental cruelty. When the hospital moved to Moorfields and later to St. George's Fields, the grandeur of its architecture gave an illusion of progress. Its facades were impressive, its halls wide, but behind the walls the same chains clinked, the same cries echoed. Patients remained subjected to treatments that were closer to torture than medicine. Ice baths, blistering, rotating chairs designed to spin them into unconsciousness. For children, whose fragile bodies could barely withstand the cold or the blows, these so-called remedies were often fatal. By the dawn of the 19th century, England began to pride itself on its supposed march toward reason and enlightenment. The Industrial Revolution was reshaping cities, and advances in science promised a brighter future. Yet Bedlam stood as a glaring contradiction, a medieval horror thriving in the very heart of modern London. Its governors spoke the language of progress, promising reforms, while the reality inside remained unchanged. The asylum was overcrowded, filthy, and underfunded. Patients, many of whom should never have been confined, were reduced to shadows of their former selves, surviving on meagre rations and enduring daily humiliation. What made Bedlam so notorious was not merely the treatment of its inmates, but the way the institution reflected society's darkest instincts. It was a mirror, one that revealed how the powerful dealt with the inconvenient. The poor, the disabled, the traumatized, and the socially unwanted could be swept into its wards, their cries muffled by thick stone walls. Children, tragically, were especially vulnerable. In an era when child welfare was scarcely considered, a boy or girl deemed troublesome, feeble-minded, or simply too burdensome could be surrendered to Bedlam's care. Their innocence was no protection. If anything, it made their suffering more poignant, more cruel. The nickname Bedlam itself became a word etched into the English language, synonymous with chaos and disorder. To Londoners, it was both a place and a symbol, invoked in plays, poems, and political speeches. It carried with it a warning. To fall into madness was to risk falling into Bedlam, and once within, there was little chance of return. This cultural weight gave the asylum an almost mythic quality, a looming reminder of society's fragility. To walk past its gates was to feel the chill of humans suffering pressing close, a reminder of how thin the line was between respectability and ruin. Even reformers struggled against Bedlam's legacy. While the early 19th century saw the rise of new asylums built on more humane principles, such as the York Retreat, which emphasized kindness and moral treatment, Bedlam clung to its old ways. Its name was too deeply tied to spectacle and cruelty, its practices too entrenched in tradition. Though new governors and physicians promised improvements, the institution seemed unable, or unwilling, to shed its skin. For children inside, these promises meant little. Their days were measured not in reforms or ideals but in meals skipped, beatings endured, and nights spent shivering in darkness. By 1845, when our story unfolds, Bedlam was caught between two worlds, the past it could not escape and the future it could not embrace. Officially, it was a hospital striving toward medical legitimacy. In reality, it was still a dungeon, its name whispered with a mix of fascination and dread. To the people of London, Bedlam remained a grotesque curiosity, a place where the insane, and, tragically, innocent children, were hidden from sight. To the inmates, it was a death sentence in all but name. The legacy of Bedlam was not only its cruelty but also its persistence. Centuries of abuse had become normalized, so deeply woven into the institution's fabric that even well-intentioned reforms barely scratched the surface. Its survival into the Victorian era is a testament to how long societies can tolerate injustice when it is cloaked in the language of necessity. Bedlam endured because London wanted it to endure. It was easier to look away, easier to call the screams inside madness rather than suffering, easier to let the most vulnerable, the poor, the desperate, and yes, the children, disappear into its shadows than to face the truth of what their existence demanded. And so, by 1845, Bedlam's legacy was complete. It was not just a building, nor just an asylum. It was an institution that embodied the darkest contradictions of human society. Charity turned cruelty, medicine turned torture, protection turned imprisonment. Its name would live on long after its walls crumbled, a word that still today conjures visions of chaos. But what we must never forget is that behind that word were lives, men, women, and children, reduced to silence by an institution that claimed to heal but thrived on suffering. Victorian London in 1845 was a city of extremes, a place where glittering progress collided headlong with suffocating misery. On one side of the River Thames, towering factories belched smoke into the sky, symbols of industrial innovation and empire. Railways cut across the land, carrying goods and passengers at speeds that seemed almost miraculous. Wealth flowed into the capital from Britain's colonies, filling the pockets of merchants, bankers, and aristocrats who built themselves imposing townhouses in districts like Mayfair and Bloomsbury. But just beyond those polished avenues, in the labyrinth of slums that sprawled through Whitechapel, Southwark, and Lambeth, life was defined by hunger, filth, and despair. The gap between rich and poor was not simply wide, it was an abyss. To walk through London in 1845 was to see two worlds existing side by side, yet utterly divided. This stark divide shaped not only the city's physical landscape but also its moral one. For the wealthy, the poor often seemed like another species entirely, their suffering reduced to background noise in the symphony of industrial progress. Disease, crime, and destitution festered in the overcrowded tenements where families of 6 or 7 crammed into a single room. The stench of sewage rose from the streets, mingling with the smoke of coal fires until the very air seemed poisoned. In these districts, childhood itself was a fragile thing, often cut short by illness or labor. Children as young as 5 or 6 worked long hours in factories, chimney sweeps flues, or as street hawkers, their bodies bent and broken before they reached adolescence. To the Victorian elite, these children were not seen as victims but as inevitabilities of urban life. The attitude toward children in 1845 must be understood through this harsh context. Childhood, as we recognize it today, a time of innocence, education, and protection, was a privilege reserved for the upper and middle classes. For the poor, children were seen less as individuals to be nurtured and more as economic units, sources of labor or burdens to be managed. Orphans, the illegitimate, or those with disabilities occupied an even lower rung on society's ladder. With no strong systems of social care, these children were often consigned to workhouses, orphanages, or, in the most tragic cases, institutions like Bedlam. A child who was poor and troubled had few defenders, and in a city overflowing with abandoned or vulnerable youth, society often responded not with compassion but with indifference. At the same time, Victorian London was undergoing a profound shift in its approach to science and medicine, though these changes often carried dark consequences. Advances in anatomy, physiology, and early psychiatry promised new understandings of the human body and mind. But these disciplines were also riddled with superstition, prejudice, and an alarming lack of ethical oversight. Physicians and reformers debated the causes of madness, attributing it alternately to heredity, moral weakness, or divine punishment. Children who displayed unusual behavior, whether from trauma, developmental disability, or simple rebellion, were labeled as feeble-minded or idiots. These labels carried devastating weight, branding a child for life and justifying their confinement. In many cases, poverty itself was mistaken for mental illness. To look poor, dirty, or malnourished was enough to be seen as defective, as if suffering from madness was a natural byproduct of destitution. The city itself seemed to feed these assumptions. The slums were filled with noise and chaos, screaming infants, drunken brawls, coughing consumptives, and to the respectable classes, this environment appeared indistinguishable from insanity. Reports from reformers and inspectors described entire neighborhoods as breeding grounds of vice and lunacy. The children who grew up in these conditions were thus condemned twice over, first by the material poverty of their existence, and second by the moral judgment of a society eager to brand them defective. It was a short step from this stigma to the doors of institutions like Bedlam. At the same time, the moral climate of Victorian London was steeped in strict social codes and religious fervour. Respectability was everything, and those who deviated from accepted norms, whether through poverty, illness, or behaviour, were quickly ostracised. The stigma of madness carried not only fear but also shame. Families who found themselves burdened with a child they considered strange or unmanageable often saw confinement as their only option. Bedlam, for all its horrors, offered a perverse kind of solution. It removed the child from public view, sparing the family the embarrassment of deviation. For the poorest families, who lacked even the meagre resources to care for their children, institutionalization was sometimes seen as the only escape from starvation. Yet even as London basked in its self-image as the capital of empire and progress, the reality of life for its most vulnerable populations was unspeakably grim. The Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834 had already hardened attitudes toward poverty, enforcing the idea that those in need should be forced into workhouses, where conditions were deliberately harsh to deter idleness. Children were not spared this cruelty. In fact, they were often its most visible victims. And while workhouses represented one form of institutional brutality, Bedlam represented another. Where the workhouse sought to discipline poverty, Bedlam sought to contain madness, though in both cases, the human beings inside were reduced to objects of control. To truly understand the horror of children being placed in Bedlam, one must grasp the wider cultural logic of 1845. This was a society that prized order over compassion, conformity over individuality. The needs of the empire, the demands of industrial progress, and the rigid moral codes of the Victorian ethos all combined to create a city that valued productivity above humanity. Children who could not fit into this system, whether through illness, trauma, or misfortune, were easily discarded. They were not seen as the future but as obstacles to it. In this way, the story of Victorian London is inseparable from the story of its institutions. The city's prisons, workhouses, and asylums were the shadow side of its gleaming factories and grand boulevards. They absorbed the unwanted, ensuring that polite society could continue undisturbed. Bedlam was the most infamous of them all, a place where the veneer of charity masked the reality of cruelty. And for the children who found themselves behind its gates, Victorian London's contradictions were not abstract, they were a daily nightmare. Thus, as we look at 1845, we see not only a city at the height of its global power but also a city that had abandoned many of its most vulnerable. It is in this context, of poverty mistaken for madness, of children stripped of childhood, of institutions that thrived on suffering, that we must understand how the children of London came to be trapped in Bedlam Asylum. Their fate was not an accident but the logical consequence of a society built on progress for some and neglect for others. And their suffering was the price that London was willing to pay to maintain its image of order, power, and respectability inside the looming walls of Bedlam Asylum. The presence of children was one of its darkest and most carefully hidden realities. By 1845, the institution had become synonymous with madness and cruelty, but what often slipped unnoticed was that among the adult inmates, many broken by disease, trauma, or neglect, were children, some barely old enough to speak in full sentences. Their small voices mingled with the anguished cries of grown men and women, swallowed by the echoing corridors of stone. To imagine a child confined in Bedlam is to confront the full weight of Victorian cruelty, innocence caged inside one of history's most infamous madhouses. Who were these children? They were not, as one might assume, only those born with severe mental illnesses. In truth, the children of Bedlam came from many different paths, each a reflection of society's failings. Some were orphans with no family to claim them, swept off the streets of London where they had begged for food or stolen scraps to survive. Others were abandoned deliberately by desperate parents who could no longer feed another mouth, or who believed their child's unruly behavior marked them as defective. Still others were placed there after minor incidents, fits of temper, night terrors, or learning difficulties, that today would be met with care but in 1845 were considered evidence of lunacy. Once the label was applied, it rarely lifted. In a society eager to rid itself of burdens, Bedlam was where children went to disappear. For a child entering Bedlam, the process itself was brutal. Upon arrival, they were stripped of their clothing and possessions, a symbolic erasure of their former lives. A boy might clutch a wooden toy or a girl a rag doll, only to have it torn from their hands by indifferent attendants. In the place of their belongings, they were given coarse uniforms that marked them as patients. Their hair was often cut short, both to control lice and to break their identity further. From the moment they crossed the threshold, they were not children anymore, they were inmates. The conditions they endured defy belief. Children were confined to the same dank wards as adults, forced to sleep on straw or bare wooden boards. There was little separation between genders or ages, meaning young boys and girls shared space with men and women suffering violent outbursts, hallucinations, and uncontrollable fits. The air was thick with the stench of unwashed bodies, mildew, and excrement. Food was scarce and often inedible, a thin gruel or crusts of bread crawling with insects. Malnutrition left the children frail and stunted, their growth arrested by starvation. Water was foul, and disease spread rapidly, further thinning their ranks. But the cruelty of Bedlam was not confined to hunger and filth. It was institutionalized into every aspect of daily life. The attendants, often poorly paid and poorly trained, ruled with violence and fear. Children who cried at night might be beaten into silence, their sobs replaced by the dull thud of a stick. Those who resisted were shackled in irons, wrists and ankles rubbed raw by chains far too heavy for their small frames. Solitary cells, dark and airless, became punishment for disobedience, and children left in them sometimes emerged days later, broken in body and spirit. To Bedlam's keepers, discipline was treatment, and suffering was medicine. Perhaps most chilling of all was the way children were made part of Bedlam's grotesque spectacle. Visitors who paid to see the asylum's lunatics did not always distinguish between adults and children. A child might be pointed out as a curiosity, their behavior laughed at by strangers peering through iron bars. Imagine a small boy, eyes wide with terror, shrinking back into shadows as laughter echoes around him. Imagine a young girl, dirty and trembling, mocked for her cries. To the paying public, this was entertainment. To the children, it was humiliation so profound that it erased any last shred of dignity they clung to. The psychological impact of this environment cannot be overstated. A child's mind, still forming, was shaped by constant exposure to violence, screams, and despair. Many developed a kind of emotional numbness, their eyes vacant, their voices hollow. Some attempted to cling to fragments of play, drawing lines in the straw or whispering rhymes to themselves, but these moments were fleeting, often punished as disruptive. Childhood was not merely stolen in Bedlam, it was obliterated. The very idea of joy, safety, or imagination was stripped away, leaving only survival. It is important to remember that not all children in Bedlam were even mentally ill. Many were simply victims of circumstance, orphans, the impoverished, or those whose families lacked the means to care for them. Yet once admitted, their chances of leaving were slim. Paperwork was lost, families vanished, and children aged into adults inside the asylum's walls, their identities swallowed by the institution. A boy abandoned at age 7 might still be there at 17, his youth wasted in chains. A girl committed at age 9 might never know the outside world again, her life compressed into the narrow confines of the asylum until death claimed her. There were whispers of resistance, of course. Some attendants reported moments when children clung to each other for comfort, forming fragile bonds of solidarity. Older children sometimes acted as protectors to the younger ones, shielding them from the worst of the violence. In rare cases, sympathetic visitors or reformers stumbled upon these forgotten lives and tried to advocate for their release. But such efforts were rare and often drowned out by the weight of bureaucracy and indifference. Bedlam was a machine, and the children were merely cogs within it, expendable, replaceable, and easily ignored. What makes their plight so haunting is the contrast it presents. Outside the asylum's walls, London celebrated progress and civilization. Newspapers boasted of railways, factories, and imperial might. Families paraded through Hyde Park, and gentlemen debated philosophy in salons. Yet in the heart of the city, children languished in a place more medieval dungeon than hospital. The contradiction is staggering. A society that proclaimed itself enlightened while allowing its most vulnerable members to rot in chains. The children trapped in Bedlam embody the darkest intersection of Victorian cruelty: poverty mistaken for madness, innocence condemned as pathology, and institutions designed to care transformed into instruments of torment. Their lives remind us that history's horrors are not abstract. They were lived by small hands, trembling voices, and beating hearts that were silenced far too soon. They were children, and they were denied not only freedom but the very right to a childhood. Their suffering is a shadow that lingers across the centuries, demanding to be remembered. The so-called treatments inflicted upon the inmates of Bedlam in 1845 remain some of the most chilling reminders of how ignorance, cruelty, and pseudoscience once masqueraded as medicine. For the children trapped within its walls, these practices were not merely misguided attempts at care, they were daily assaults upon their bodies and minds. When we speak of treatments at Bedlam, we must first strip away the notion of healing, for these methods were rooted in control, punishment, and spectacle rather than compassion. What was justified as therapy was, in truth, torture, and children were among the most vulnerable recipients of this brutality. At the heart of Victorian psychiatry lay a belief that madness was a kind of imbalance that could be purged, corrected, or beaten out of a patient. Physicians of the era, working with limited scientific understanding, clung to ancient ideas drawn from Galen and the humoral theory. Madness was thought to stem from excesses of blood, bile, or phlegm, and so the first and most common treatment was bloodletting. Even children were not spared. Doctors opened veins in their thin arms or used leeches, attaching the writhing creatures to their skin to drain what was believed to be diseased blood. The result was not recovery but weakness, dizziness, and in many cases collapse. Small bodies, already starved from poor rations, could not endure the repeated loss of blood. Yet to the physicians of Bedlam, such suffering was a sign of progress. Another widely used method was cold water immersion, sometimes called the shocking bath. Children were plunged into tubs of freezing water or doused with buckets until their lips turned blue and their teeth chattered violently. The rationale was simple and cruel. The sudden chill was thought to jolt the mind back to reason. In practice, it was an ordeal that left children gasping for breath, shivering uncontrollably, and often ill with fever or pneumonia. Imagine a child of 7 or 8, screaming in terror as attendants forced them under the water, their small hands clawing for air, only to be held down by rough hands until their body went limp with exhaustion. The cold bath was not therapy. It was punishment dressed as science. Mechanical restraints formed another cornerstone of Bedlam's regime. Straitjackets, iron shackles, and heavy manacles were used liberally, often for hours or days at a time. Children who fidgeted, cried, or resisted were bound until their arms ached and circulation cut off in their limbs. Some were confined in restraint chairs, strapped upright, and left immobile for endless hours, their small bodies slumping in exhaustion. Others were forced into iron cages or barred cribs, ostensibly to keep them safe but in reality to make them easier to control. The physical scars of such practices, bruised wrists, raw ankles, dislocated shoulders, were matched only by the emotional ones: fear of movement, fear of speaking, fear of simply existing. Equally terrifying were the spinning chairs, a device invented in the late 18th century but still in use by the mid-19th. Patients, including children, were strapped into a chair suspended from the ceiling and spun rapidly in circles, sometimes for minutes on end. The idea was that dizziness, nausea, and unconsciousness would reset the brain. In reality, it induced vomiting, vertigo, and severe trauma. Witnesses described children screaming until they lost consciousness, their bodies limp and pale, only to be revived and subjected again. Physicians recorded these experiments with cold detachment, noting the effects as though the children were little more than lab animals. Isolation was another weapon in Bedlam's arsenal. Children who cried at night or resisted their attendants were often thrown into solitary cells, dark, damp, and airless. These chambers, designed more like punishment dungeons than hospital rooms, stripped the child of light, warmth, and human contact. Hours turned into days, and days into weeks. Alone in the dark, with only the sound of dripping water or distant screams, children's minds fractured under the weight of fear. Many emerged silent, withdrawn, unable to speak in more than whispers. Others descended into despair so deep it was indistinguishable from the madness they had been accused of. Alongside these physical torments were so-called moral treatments, which in practice often meant humiliation. Children might be forced to wear placards around their necks announcing their supposed sins: liar, thief, idiot, paraded in front of other inmates as a lesson in obedience. Some were denied food for minor disobedience, left to starve until their bodies curled inward with hunger pains. Others were forced to perform menial labor, scrubbing floors or carrying buckets, as though toil could cleanse the mind. These punishments, couched in the language of correction, were nothing less than cruelty institutionalized. Medical experimentation also lurked in the shadows of Bedlam. With children considered lesser, disposable lives, they sometimes became the subjects of physicians' trials. Tonics of dubious concoction were forced down their throats, mixtures of mercury, opium, or laudanum. While these drugs dulled pain or induced stupor, they also poisoned the body and clouded the mind. Children staggered through the wards in chemical fogs, their small frames racked with side effects, while doctors scribbled notes about dosages and outcomes. To the outside world, this might have looked like science. To the children, it was another form of torment. Perhaps most haunting was the way these treatments blurred the line between healing and harm, normalizing cruelty under the guise of medicine. Families who surrendered their children to Bedlam were told that these methods offered the best chance of recovery, that science and discipline would restore order to troubled minds. In reality, few children ever improved. Many grew weaker, their bodies wasting under the combined assault of malnutrition and torture. Some died quietly, their deaths recorded in ledgers that reduced them to names and dates. Others survived, but only as shadows of themselves, scarred by trauma so deep it followed them for life. For the staff, these treatments reinforced control. Bedlam was overcrowded, chaotic, and poorly resourced. Attendants, many untrained and brutalized by their own lives, relied on fear to maintain order. Chains, cold baths, and beatings were quicker than compassion. Doctors, desperate to appear authoritative, clung to outdated theories and cruel experiments to assert their legitimacy. And society, eager to look away, accepted these horrors as the necessary cost of dealing with madness. When we consider these treatments today, they seem barbaric beyond comprehension. Yet they remind us of a grim truth. Cruelty often thrives when it cloaks itself in authority. The children of Bedlam were not just victims of an asylum. They were victims of a worldview that confused suffering with science, punishment with progress. Their small bodies bore the marks of iron shackles, their lungs carried the chill of cold water, and their minds bore scars no physician ever recorded. To walk through Bedlam in 1845 was to witness these methods in practice, to hear the screams of children forced under icy water, to see their frail limbs bound in chains, to watch them stumble after being bled of strength. It was a theatre of cruelty, and the patients, especially the youngest, were the unwilling performers. What Bedlam called treatment was, in truth, the systematic breaking of human beings, leaving us with the haunting question: how many children might have lived full, vibrant lives had they not been subjected to the cold hands of this so-called medicine? The children of Bedlam were not statistics. They were individuals, each carrying a story of abandonment, despair, and forgotten humanity. To understand the full horror of their plight, we must look beyond the broad descriptions of the asylum's cruelty and into the personal narratives that flicker through the historical record. Though many names and details have been lost to time, fragments of reports, witness testimonies, and contemporary writings allow us to reconstruct the haunting lives of those young souls who were swallowed by Bedlam's walls. Their stories are not easy to hear, but they force us to remember that behind every ledger entry marked lunatic was a child who once laughed, played, and dreamed. One such case is that of a boy known only as Thomas, admitted in the early 1840s at the age of 7. His mother had died of tuberculosis, his father was imprisoned for theft, and Thomas, thin, dirty, and perpetually hungry, was found wandering the streets. Authorities judged him unruly, his erratic behavior mistaken for madness rather than the trauma of neglect. Within weeks, he was sent to Bedlam. Witnesses describe him as wild-eyed, with a habit of rocking back and forth as he sat on the floor. To modern eyes, this was the coping mechanism of a terrified child. To Bedlam's keepers, it was evidence of lunacy. Thomas spent years locked inside the asylum, subjected to cold baths and restraints, until eventually he grew silent, his boyish energy extinguished. He was still listed on the asylum rolls a decade later, no longer a child but a hollow young man who had never known freedom. Another story tells of a girl called Mary Ann, only 9 years old when she was admitted. Her family, crushed by poverty, believed her possessed after she suffered a series of epileptic seizures. In Victorian London, epilepsy was often conflated with madness, and children who suffered from it were frequently institutionalized. At Bedlam, Mary Ann was treated with bloodletting and laudanum, her seizures misunderstood as proof of incurable insanity. Attendants tied her down during episodes, her small body thrashing against leather straps while others watched in terror. Visitors later reported seeing her curled in a corner of her ward, clutching at her hair and whispering to herself. There is no record of her release. For Mary Ann, Bedlam was both misdiagnosis and life sentence. Perhaps most chilling is the account of Samuel, a child of 6, who entered the asylum after being found abandoned at a workhouse. He was described as slow of speech and prone to staring blankly at others. In a modern context, this might suggest developmental delay or even autism. But in the 1840s, such differences were interpreted as dangerous defects. Bedlam offered no education, no therapy, no chance for Samuel to flourish. Instead, attendants mocked his slowness, visitors jeered at his vacant stare, and physicians labeled him incurable. One observer wrote of seeing Samuel clutching a rag doll he had fashioned from scraps of straw, rocking it like a baby. It was the last vestige of play in a life otherwise stripped bare. Samuel remained institutionalized until his death from fever before the age of 12. And then there was Elizabeth, admitted around age 13, whose tragedy exposes the darker currents of gender and class. She had been born to a poor family in Southwark and worked as a servant. After her employer accused her of hysteria and disobedience, she was declared unfit for work and cast into Bedlam. Her alleged hysteria may have been little more than grief after the death of her mother or simple resistance to abuse in the household. But in an era when female disobedience was pathologized, Bedlam became her punishment. Accounts suggest she was subjected to spinning chair treatments and forced labor inside the asylum. What remains most striking is the testimony of a visitor who recalled Elizabeth's haunting eyes, a child's face with a woman's sorrow. Her fate, like so many, was to vanish into obscurity. These stories illustrate how children entered Bedlam not because of inherent madness but because of misfortune, misunderstanding, or prejudice. Poverty, trauma, illness, or mere difference could condemn a child to lifelong confinement. Once inside, the asylum system erased their individuality, reducing them to symptoms and labels. Idiot, imbecile, lunatic, these were the words that replaced their names. Their humanity was obscured beneath categories that justified cruelty. For those who survived longer in Bedlam, survival often meant adapting in tragic ways. Some children learned to stay utterly still, to avoid the gaze of attendants or the blows of guards. Others clung to whispered friendships, bonds forged in the darkness of shared suffering. There are records of children holding hands at night, comforting each other against the echo of screams. These fragile connections were acts of resistance, quiet defiance against a world determined to erase them. Yet even these bonds were precarious. Attendants often separated children who grew too close, fearing disobedience or escape. Loneliness was a weapon, deliberately wielded to keep the young inmates subdued. The psychological toll was immense. Witnesses described children staring blankly at walls for hours, their expressions vacant. Some developed nervous tics or compulsive rocking, ways of soothing themselves in unbearable circumstances. Others lashed out, their anger and fear exploding in violent bursts that were swiftly punished with chains or isolation. In this cycle of trauma and reprisal, many children internalized the very madness they had been accused of, fulfilling the grim prophecy that had condemned them. And yet, amid the horror, fragments of resilience shine through. The case notes of one physician mention a boy who sang hymns softly to himself each night, his voice a trembling defiance against despair. Another child was recorded scratching shapes into the wooden walls, crude drawings of houses and trees, reminders of a world beyond Bedlam's gates. These moments, though fleeting, reveal the indomitable spark of childhood, struggling to survive even in the bleakest of places. The tragedy is not only that these children suffered, but that their suffering was rendered invisible. Few official records highlight their presence. Inspectors and reformers occasionally noted the shocking side of infants among lunatics, but their reports rarely led to meaningful change. Most children's stories exist only in fragments, scattered references in visitor journals, offhand remarks in medical notes, or the occasional compassionate observation from a reformer. Their silence in the historical record is itself a testament to how thoroughly they were erased. To remember these children is to confront the uncomfortable truth that they were never given the chance to be remembered in their own time. They were hidden, silenced, and reduced to shadows in the corridors of an infamous asylum. Their lives, cut short or forever altered, remind us that cruelty often thrives not only in acts of violence but also in acts of neglect, when a society chooses not to see. By piecing together these scattered stories, we restore a measure of dignity to Thomas, Mary Ann, Samuel, Elizabeth, and countless others whose names are lost. They were children who deserved warmth, play, and protection. Instead, they were trapped in a place that turned innocence into spectacle and suffering into routine. Their forgotten stories force us to ask not only how such cruelty was possible, but also how many other lives have been erased in the silences of history. In the London of 1845, Bedlam was not merely a hospital, it was a spectacle. For centuries, the asylum had been infamous for allowing visitors to wander its wards, peering into cells and gawking at those deemed lunatics. Though reforms were said to have curtailed the worst excesses by the mid-19th century, the culture of entertainment had not disappeared. The public's fascination with madness was insatiable, and Bedlam became a stage where suffering children were unwilling performers. To the city, it was a grotesque diversion, a place where the horrors of mental illness and institutional cruelty could be consumed as amusement, a penny-priced theatre of human despair. The practice of opening Bedlam to visitors had begun much earlier, during the 17th century, but by 1845 it had become deeply woven into London's culture. Families would pay a small fee, sometimes just a penny or two, to stroll through the asylum's galleries. What awaited them was a parade of human misery. Men and women restrained in chains, rocking back and forth, shouting incoherently, or lying silent in straw. Guides or attendants would sometimes incite patients to perform, provoking outbursts to entertain the crowd. The effect was part freak show, part zoo, and part moral lesson, as visitors left whispering about the thin line between sanity and bedlam. Children were not exempt from this macabre display. Visitors often expressed shock at seeing young faces among the inmates, yet their curiosity kept them from turning away. A small boy, filthy and shivering, might be pointed out as a curiosity. See how the madness takes even the young. A girl clutching her knees in the corner might become the subject of whispered pity or laughter. The indignity of being watched, mocked, or pitted by strangers compounded the trauma of confinement. For a child who had already lost home, family, and freedom, to be put on display as a living exhibit was a final act of dehumanization. For the institution itself, the spectacle served a practical purpose: profit. Bedlam, perpetually underfunded and overcrowded, relied on visitors' fees to supplement its income. Governors justified the practice by claiming it offered financial relief for the asylum's upkeep. In reality, it incentivized cruelty. The more shocking the display, the more likely visitors were to return, and so attendants had little reason to shield children or other vulnerable inmates from public gaze. Instead, they ensured that the wards remained open and the suffering visible. Bedlam was not only an asylum, it was a business. The visitors themselves represented a cross-section of Victorian society. Wealthy gentlemen and ladies arrived in carriages, seeking titillation under the guise of charity. Middle-class families brought their children, instructing them to observe the dangers of idleness and vice. Even the poor scraped together pennies for admission, eager to witness what they could not otherwise imagine. For all, the experience offered a perverse reassurance. By seeing the mad contained within Bedlam's walls, they confirmed their own place in the fragile hierarchy of sanity. To gaze upon the suffering of others was to affirm one's distance from it. The culture of spectacle extended beyond the asylum walls into popular media. Broadsheets and penny dreadfuls printed lurid stories about Bedlam's inmates, painting them as dangerous curiosities or tragic figures. Plays and ballads used Bedlam as shorthand for chaos and madness, reinforcing its cultural weight. Even the word Bedlam entered everyday speech, a casual metaphor for disorder, erasing the real humans suffering behind the term. Children within the asylum thus became doubly invisible, seen as entertainment in person, yet erased into metaphor in public discourse. Their lives were consumed, both literally and symbolically, by a society that treated their pain as material. The cruelty of turning human suffering into public amusement was not unique to Bedlam, but it was perhaps nowhere so blatant. In Victorian London, the lines between morality, curiosity, and cruelty were blurred. Public hangings drew crowds of thousands. Freak shows paraded individuals with physical differences before gawking audiences. Bedlam's exhibitions fit neatly into this culture of spectacle, reinforcing the city's appetite for entertainment rooted in the suffering of others. That children were part of this display made it all the more grotesque. The laughter of onlookers rang in their ears, branding them not only as prisoners but as performers in their own humiliation. Eyewitness accounts capture the chilling effect of this practice. One visitor described walking through the asylum and seeing a boy of tender years, no more than 10, pressed against the bars, his eyes wide as if in perpetual terror. Another wrote of a young girl mocked by fellow visitors for her muttering, her words dismissed as nonsense though they may well have been pleas for help. These glimpses remind us that the public's gaze was not benign curiosity, it was intrusion, mockery, and violation. The children endured not only the cruelty of attendants but also the endless humiliation of strangers who treated their lives as entertainment. The moral blindness of Victorian society is perhaps most striking here. Many visitors saw their trips to Bedlam as a form of education, a way to remind themselves of the importance of order, piety, and discipline. They returned home comforted by the thought that madness was contained within the asylum, safely separated from their world. Few paused to question the ethics of watching children suffer. Few recognized that poverty, trauma, or illness, not inherent madness, had consigned these young souls to such torment. The children's pain became invisible, subsumed by the city's hunger for diversion. For the children themselves, the constant exposure to strangers deepened their sense of worthlessness. They learned that their lives had no privacy, no dignity, no protection. Every scream, every tear, every trembling silence was subject to the gaze of outsiders. Over time, many retreated inward, their voices silenced, their identities erased. To survive meant to endure not only the brutality of the institution but also the cruelty of the world that came to watch. Bedlam's status as a spectacle persisted because it aligned with society's values: profit, curiosity, and control. The asylum presented itself as both a warning and a reassurance, a place where the boundaries of sanity were drawn in stark relief. The children caught in the system became the most tragic symbols of all, their suffering commodified for pennies. They were not simply hidden away, they were displayed, consumed, and discarded by a society that cloaked its cruelty in the guise of fascination. In the end, the public spectacle of Bedlam revealed as much about Victorian London as it did about the asylum itself. It exposed a society willing to turn suffering into entertainment, to exploit vulnerability for profit, and to erase the humanity of its most fragile members. For the children trapped within, every visitor who passed by their cell was a reminder that their pain was not hidden. It was seen, mocked, and ignored. Their lives were not simply confined, they were consumed, turned into a grotesque sideshow for a city that prided itself on progress while feasting on cruelty. By 1845, whispers of reform were circling around the infamous walls of Bedlam. For centuries, the asylum had symbolized cruelty disguised as care, and its notoriety was so great that even those in positions of power could no longer entirely ignore it. The Victorian age prided itself on being the age of reason, science, and progress, and yet Bedlam remained a medieval relic in the very heart of London. The contradiction gnawed at reformers, philanthropists, and journalists alike, who began demanding change. Still, change came slowly, unevenly, and often at the expense of those who needed it most. Children, in particular, remained forgotten even as new policies were announced with great fanfare. The reform movement had its roots in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, when new approaches to mental health care were being tested elsewhere in England and Europe. The York Retreat, founded by Quakers in 1796, became the model for what was called moral treatment. Instead of chains, patients were offered routine, kindness, and quiet surroundings. Instead of punishment, they were given activities and education. These ideas spread into reformer circles, inspiring debates about the brutality of asylums like Bedlam. Writers and inspectors began asking why London's most prominent psychiatric hospital could not adopt similar practices. If humane treatment was possible elsewhere, why was Bedlam still shackling, starving, and parading its patients for profit? The pressure grew during the early 19th century as social reform became a rallying cry in many areas of British life. Philanthropists campaigned against child labour, exposing the horrors of factory work. Writers like Charles Dickens laid bare the cruelty of workhouses. In this climate, the abuses of Bedlam were ripe for exposure. Journalists published scathing accounts of the asylum, describing the filth, overcrowding, and violence within. Inspectors noted the shocking presence of children among the inmates, though their observations often seemed almost casual, as if even reformers did not know how to process the sight of the young locked among the mad. One figure who helped push change was Edward Wakefield, a prison reformer who visited Bedlam and recorded his observations in grim detail. He described patients left naked in filth, attendants beating inmates without consequence, and children wandering among adults in terrifying conditions. His writings shocked the public and stirred debate in Parliament. Other investigators followed, including members of the Metropolitan Commissioners and Lunacy, who produced reports in the 1840s cataloguing abuses and recommending improvements. These documents did not always translate into immediate action, but they marked a turning point. Bedlam's horrors were no longer hidden. They had been dragged into public view, and the institution could no longer rely solely on silence to shield it. Reforms did begin to take shape, though their impact was uneven. The use of mechanical restraints, for instance, began to decline in theory, replaced by the rhetoric of non-restraint. Yet in practice, many children and adults continued to be shackled or confined. Solitary cells were said to be abolished, but isolation persisted under other names. Medical treatments were reframed as scientific, but the cold baths and bloodletting continued. The reforms looked good on paper, but inside the walls, the old cruelties persisted, particularly for those least likely to be defended, the children. Part of the problem was that reform often centered on appearances rather than substance. When officials visited Bedlam, attendants cleaned the wards, fed the patients slightly better meals, and hid the worst cases. Children were sometimes moved temporarily, concealed from inspectors' eyes. The public reports painted a picture of progress, while in reality the suffering continued just as before. It was reform as performance, designed to soothe public outrage without addressing the underlying brutality. Another obstacle was the very perception of children in Victorian society. Reformers saw adult patients as tragic figures who might be restored to usefulness, but children were often viewed as hopeless cases. Idiocy and imbecility were considered permanent states, not conditions that might improve with care. To many reformers, the plight of children in Bedlam was not a priority because they were already written off as lost. The reforms that did emerge, the reduction of restraints, improved food, or new wards, were aimed at adults deemed redeemable. The children were left behind, their suffering overlooked even by those who spoke most passionately about humane treatment. Despite these failures, the reform movement did achieve some important victories. The spectacle of public visits was increasingly condemned and eventually abolished, cutting off one of the most humiliating aspects of Bedlam's regime. Funding was increased, and new medical staff were appointed, some of whom genuinely tried to introduce more humane practices. Bedlam itself underwent physical changes, with its architecture altered to appear more hospital-like and less prison-like. These shifts marked the slow evolution of the asylum from dungeon to medical institution, even if cruelty lingered in its wards. For the children, however, the reality remained grim. While inspectors wrote of improved conditions, they rarely recorded what this meant for the youngest inmates. A child still lay shivering on straw at night, still endured cold baths and forced feedings, still heard the screams of adults echoing through the halls. The reforms might have lessened the spectacle for the public, but they did little to relieve the daily torment of those trapped inside. The children of Bedlam were rarely seen as central to the reform agenda, and so their suffering persisted in silence. What the reform movement did accomplish was the beginning of a cultural shift. The Victorian public, once eager to gawk at Bedlam's inmates, began to feel a pang of guilt, even shame, at the thought of human beings treated like animals. Writers, activists, and politicians used Bedlam as a symbol of all that needed to change in Britain's institutions. The asylum's notoriety became a tool for progress, a reminder that cruelty could not forever be hidden behind stone walls. In this sense, the suffering of children, though largely ignored directly, helped fuel the outrage that eventually transformed how society thought about madness itself. Yet we must not mistake these steps for salvation. Bedlam's reforms were partial, halting, and often hollow. The children within its walls remained victims of neglect, caught between a brutal past and an uncertain future. Their suffering reminds us that reform is not always redemption. It can be cosmetic, political, or selective, leaving the most vulnerable to endure unchanged horrors while society congratulates itself on progress. In the story of Bedlam, the reform movement is both a glimmer of hope and a bitter disappointment. It showed that cruelty could be challenged, that institutions could be forced to change. But it also revealed how easily reforms can bypass those most in need, how children, silent, invisible, and powerless, were sacrificed even in the name of progress. The reforms of the 1840s did not rescue them, they simply altered the scenery of their suffering. By the mid-19th century, Victorian London was intoxicated with the promise of science. The Industrial Revolution had filled the city with machines, inventions, and discoveries that seemed to prove humanity was advancing toward a brighter future. Yet, beneath the surface of genuine innovation, darker currents of thought were forming. The rise of pseudosciences such as phrenology and the early whispers of what would later become eugenics created a worldview that justified cruelty to the vulnerable. For the children locked away in Bedlam, these ideas were not abstract theories but lived realities. They were labeled, measured, and dismissed as defective, their very existence framed as a burden to society. In 1845, the asylum's youngest inmates were trapped not only by walls of stone but also by the invisible chains of ideology. Phrenology, the popular science of reading mental traits from the shape of the skull, played a particularly sinister role. Practitioners claimed they could identify criminality, intelligence, or insanity by measuring bumps and depressions on the head. For children, this meant that any irregularity, a protruding brow, an asymmetrical skull, could be used as evidence of innate madness. Physicians at Bedlam sometimes employed such methods to classify young patients, declaring them incurable based on nothing more than the contours of their heads. Imagine a child trembling as a physician ran calipers across their scalp, their fate sealed by arbitrary numbers and pseudoscience. These so-called diagnoses stripped children of hope, branding them as defective before they had even lived long enough to form an identity. Alongside phrenology was the growing obsession with heredity. Victorians increasingly believed that madness, poverty, and criminality were not products of circumstance but inherited traits. Families with histories of illness or instability were considered tainted, their offspring presumed doomed from birth. For children in Bedlam, this belief was a death sentence of stigma. A child who had done nothing more than be born into a poor or troubled family was assumed to carry the taint of degeneracy. To reformers and physicians alike, such children were hopeless cases, better confined than released into society. The asylum thus became not a place of treatment but a warehouse for the unfit. This line of thought laid the groundwork for what would later crystallize into eugenics, the idea that society could be improved by controlling who was allowed to reproduce. While the eugenics movement would not fully emerge until later in the 19th century, its seeds were already present in 1845. Discussions of idiocy and imbecility framed children as drains on resources, lives unworthy of full investment. Some reformers argued that society had no obligation to educate or rehabilitate such children, only to contain them. Within Bedlam, this translated into neglect. Why waste food, education, or care on a child believed to be inherently defective? The logic was chilling in its simplicity. Survival and compassion were reserved for those deemed useful. Religious beliefs also intertwined with these pseudosciences, creating a particularly grim moral framework. Many Victorians interpreted madness as divine punishment, the physical manifestation of sin. Children were not spared from this judgment. A boy with epilepsy might be seen as cursed, a girl with developmental delays as the product of her parents' moral failings. Bedlam's children bore the weight of this stigma, treated not as innocent victims of misfortune but as evidence of corruption in the bloodline. Their suffering was spiritualized, written off as the natural order of things. The role of poverty in this ideology cannot be overstated. In Victorian London, poverty itself was often equated with degeneracy. To be poor was to be suspect, and to be a poor child with behavioral or developmental struggles was to be condemned. Many children in Bedlam were not mad by any reasonable definition. They were simply impoverished, malnourished, or traumatized. Yet the prevailing belief was that poverty bred madness, that the poor were inherently prone to vice and insanity. Thus, Bedlam became a convenient dumping ground for children society wished to erase, those who reminded the city of the fragility of its supposed progress. Medical writings of the time reveal this chilling worldview. Physicians describe children in terms that dehumanize them: idiot child, imbecile youth, creature unfit for society. These labels were more than words. They were sentences that defined how the children would be treated. Once categorized, they ceased to be individuals. They were not Thomas, or Mary Ann, or Samuel. They were pathologies, case studies, examples and lectures. Their humanity was stripped away by the very science that claimed to illuminate the human mind. What makes this particularly haunting is how these beliefs rationalize cruelty. When attendants chained a child to a wall, they did so under the assumption that restraint was necessary for a defective being. When physicians bled or dunked children in freezing water, they did so convinced they were combating inherited madness. When society ignored the cries of children locked away, it did so reassured by the knowledge that these children were doomed from birth. Pseudoscience and prejudice worked hand in hand to silence compassion, transforming acts of violence into acts of supposed necessity. The wider cultural conversation reinforced these ideas. Popular literature of the time frequently portrayed the poor and mentally ill as grotesque, dangerous, or laughable. Characters in plays and novels mocked idiots or used madness as a shorthand for chaos. Children with differences were often depicted as cursed or monstrous, shaping public perception in ways that justified exclusion. Bedlam's children thus lived not only behind physical bars but behind cultural ones, trapped in a narrative that erased their humanity long before history did. And yet, these beliefs were not universally accepted. A small but growing number of reformers argued that madness was not inherited sin but the product of environment and trauma. They called for education, compassion, and improved care. Their voices were faint in 1845 but represented the beginnings of a shift that would, in time, challenge the pseudoscientific cruelties of the age. Still, for the children already trapped in Bedlam, such ideas came too late. The ideologies of phrenology, heredity, and degeneracy sealed their fate, convincing society that they were beyond saving. In reflecting on these ideas, we see how science, when twisted by prejudice, can become as dangerous as superstition. The children of Bedlam were not simply imprisoned by stone walls. They were imprisoned by worldviews that define them as less than human. They remind us that cruelty does not always wear the face of violence. Sometimes it wears the mask of knowledge, cloaking itself in the language of progress while destroying lives in the process. For the children of Bedlam, the rise of pseudoscience was not an abstract debate in lecture halls. It was a sentence that ensured their suffering, justified their neglect, and consigned them to history's shadows. In the grim silence of Bedlam, escape seemed impossible. The walls were thick stone, the doors barred with iron, and the attendants quick with chains and blows. Yet even in this fortress of despair, there flickered rare moments of resistance, survival, and, astonishingly, escape. For the children confined within, whose lives were otherwise defined by powerlessness, such stories became the whispered legends of the asylum, proof that not all hope was extinguished. These tales, though few and often half-hidden in scattered reports, reveal that even in the darkest conditions, the human spirit yearns for freedom. Some escapes were literal, daring attempts to flee the asylum's grip. Accounts exist of children who slipped through broken windows or darted past inattentive guards. One story tells of a boy of about 12, unnamed in records, who managed to wriggle free during a chaotic brawl between patients and attendants. He was seen running barefoot down the street, his thin frame darting through the fog as guards gave chase. Whether he ever reached safety remains unknown. No follow-up record survives, but the image of his desperate sprint is enough to suggest the unquenchable will to live outside those walls. For children raised in a world where every door was locked, even a fleeting moment of freedom was an act of rebellion. More often, however, resistance was quieter, less visible but no less powerful. Children who had little chance of physically escaping created pockets of resistance through imagination, play, or solidarity. Small acts, like scratching crude drawings into the wooden beams, singing lullabies in whispers, or clutching straw dolls fashioned from scraps, were a kind of escape, proof that their inner selves could not be fully broken. In a world where they were stripped of names and dignity, these tiny rebellions preserved fragments of their humanity. An inspector once wrote of a girl who smiled at invisible companions, her imagination conjuring friends where reality offered only cruelty. To the staff, this was madness. To her, it was survival. There were also moments when outsiders intervened, offering rare opportunities for release. Reformers who visited Bedlam sometimes spotted children and were horrified to discover them among adult lunatics. In rare cases, such visits led to petitions for a child's discharge. One such account involves a boy named Henry, around 10 years old, who had been committed after his mother's death left him without guardianship. A visiting magistrate was reportedly appalled at the sight of him chained in a corner, and after inquiries, secured his removal to a charitable orphanage. Henry's fate after that is uncertain, but his story is a rare example of escape not through his own efforts, but through the conscience of an outsider unwilling to look away. Not all resistance ended in freedom. Some ended in tragedy. Children who lashed out at attendants, striking, biting, or refusing to obey, were often beaten savagely, confined in irons, or thrown into isolation cells. These acts of defiance were desperate attempts to reclaim agency, to remind their captors that they were more than passive bodies. Yet Bedlam crushed such defiance swiftly. Still, in the very act of resistance, these children affirmed their existence. They refused, however briefly, to be reduced to silent shadows. Their cries and struggles were evidence of lives that refused to surrender entirely. Letters smuggled out of the asylum also hint at forms of resistance. Though literacy among child inmates was rare, older children sometimes dictated words to sympathetic adults or scrawled crude pleas for help. Some of these letters, intercepted by reformers or governors, spoke in heartbreaking simplicity: "Please take me out," or "I am not mad." These fragile scraps of communication remind us that children inside Bedlam did not accept their fate in silence. They reached outward, seeking any hand that might pull them from the abyss. Whether these letters were ever answered remains uncertain, but the act of writing itself was defiance. There were, too, stories of children who adapted so thoroughly that their survival itself was a form of escape. They learned how to navigate the asylum's brutal rhythms, avoiding the blows of attendants, keeping their heads down, and blending into the shadows. Some even earned small privileges by performing chores or feigning obedience. These strategies were not true freedom, but they allowed children to carve out fragile spaces of safety. Psychologists today would recognize this as resilience, the ability to endure trauma by finding ways, however imperfect, to live within it. For a child in Bedlam, to endure a single day without beatings or hunger was itself a victory. Perhaps the most haunting escapes were those of the imagination. For children trapped in an asylum that offered no education, no comfort, and no love, the mind became the only sanctuary. Witnesses described children who created elaborate fantasies, speaking to invisible friends or recounting stories of homes they no longer had. These inner worlds were fragile yet powerful, allowing them to escape the physical confines of Bedlam if only in their minds. To the physicians, these flights of imagination were dismissed as delusion. To the children, they were lifelines, the only way to remain connected to a world beyond chains and straw. Still, a handful of children truly did leave Bedlam behind. Records show that some were discharged when families reclaimed them, often after circumstances improved or shame lessened. A girl admitted at age 8 was eventually retrieved by an aunt who had gained enough means to care for her, though by then, the child was described as withdrawn and fearful. Others aged out, transferred to different institutions deemed more appropriate for adults. While these fates were hardly joyous, they represent the narrow cracks in Bedlam's walls through which a few young souls slipped. Their survival is a reminder that even in a system built to contain, some managed to find release. The existence of these rare escapes and acts of resistance is vital, because they remind us that the children of Bedlam were not passive victims alone. They fought, dreamed, adapted, and reached outward. Their resistance, whether through action or imagination, was an assertion of their humanity in a world that sought to erase it. These stories complicate the narrative of pure victimhood, showing us resilience in the unlikeliest of places. Yet the rarity of these escapes also underscores the bleakness of Bedlam's reality. For every Henry who was removed, for every boy who fled into the fog, countless others remained behind, their attempts at resistance crushed into silence. The asylum's machinery of control was relentless, and its ideology of incurability ensured that most children were forgotten. For many, the only true escape was death, their small bodies buried in unmarked graves, their names erased from history. Still, the echoes of resistance matter. They tell us that even in the darkest corners of human cruelty, children found ways to assert life. Their stories, however fragmentary, survive as a testament to the enduring spark of hope. They remind us that while Bedlam sought to strip them of humanity, it never fully succeeded. Even in chains, even in darkness, the children resisted, through flight, through defiance, through dreams. And in remembering them today, we honor that resistance, ensuring that their fight to be seen, heard, and free is not entirely lost to history. The story of Bedlam did not end in 1845, though the mid-19th century marks a turning point in its long and infamous history. By then, its reputation had spread far beyond London, cementing it as a symbol of everything cruel, chaotic, and shameful in the treatment of the mentally ill. The very name Bedlam had slipped into everyday speech, a shorthand for madness itself. Yet institutions, like people, are not immortal. As the century advanced, Bedlam began to collapse under the weight of its notoriety, its outdated practices, and the growing pressure of reform. The fall of Bedlam is not a simple tale of sudden justice or redemption. It is a slow unraveling, a dismantling of a system that resisted change for far too long. By the 1850s, the rise of psychiatry as a medical discipline placed the asylum under increasing scrutiny. The Metropolitan Commissioners in Lunacy, established in 1845, began conducting more regular inspections, demanding cleaner conditions and proper records. Reports condemned overcrowding, the lack of trained staff, and the persistence of brutal treatments. Newspapers fueled the fire with sensational stories of abuse, and Bedlam's governors found themselves constantly on the defensive. They insisted the asylum was modernizing, adopting non-restraint policies and more scientific treatments. But the reality lagged behind the rhetoric. Children and adults alike continued to suffer, their daily lives barely improved by reforms trumpeted in public. What truly doomed Bedlam was the sheer weight of its reputation. Other asylums, newer and more humane in appearance, began to rise across Britain. Institutions in York, Nottingham, and even smaller towns prided themselves on being more progressive, adopting moral treatment and pastoral settings. Compared to these, Bedlam seemed archaic, a relic of the medieval past lingering in an age of supposed enlightenment. Reformers repeatedly pointed to Bedlam as the example of what must be abolished, the cautionary tale of institutional cruelty. Its very name had become toxic, associated not with healing but with horror. In 1815, before the children's era we focus on, Bedlam had already been relocated from Moorfields to a new building at St. George's Fields in Southwark. The move was intended to symbolize progress, with its grand facade and spacious grounds meant to impress. Yet even in this new location, the old cruelties persisted. By the mid-19th century, critics argued that simply moving Bedlam again, or renaming it, could not erase the deep stain of its history. The asylum structure itself was part of the problem. Vast, impersonal wards where patients were warehoused rather than treated. The system was broken at its core. As the century wore on, more decisive changes arrived. In 1930, Bethlem Royal Hospital officially moved to Beckenham in Kent, abandoning its old buildings in London. This final relocation marked the symbolic end of Bedlam's reign as a central figure in the city's life. By then, the language around mental illness had shifted, though stigma remained. The new facility presented itself as a modern hospital, a place of treatment rather than punishment. Yet the shadows of Bedlam followed it, and even today, the word evokes images of chains, screams, and cruelty. For the children who had been confined within its walls in earlier decades, the fall of Bedlam came too late. By the time reforms had gained traction, most had either grown into broken adults or perished within the asylum. Records of child inmates largely vanish from the official archives, not because they were freed but because they were absorbed into the broader population as they aged. Their individual stories were erased by time, their graves unmarked, their memories drowned in silence. The fall of Bedlam may have marked a victory for reform, but it was no triumph for those children. Their lives had already been consumed. Their suffering endured long before the institution began to crumble. The end of Bedlam also forces us to question whether the reforms that replaced it truly solved the problems. Other asylums might have appeared more humane, but overcrowding, neglect, and abuse persisted across the Victorian system. Children continued to be institutionalized well into the late 19th and early 20th centuries, though not always in Bedlam itself. The logic of confinement, that those who did not fit society's norms could be hidden away, remained largely intact. Bedlam may have fallen, but the mentality that created it endured. At the same time, the symbolic fall of Bedlam carried great cultural weight. Writers, reformers, and historians used it as evidence of progress, a marker that Britain was leaving behind the barbarities of the past. Its ruins became objects of fascination, its stories retold in both horror and triumph. In this way, Bedlam's end was not merely the closure of a hospital but the transformation of a cultural icon. The institution itself vanished, but the legend of Bedlam lived on, a warning etched into the memory of the city. Even today, when we speak of chaos, we invoke the word Bedlam. This linguistic survival is part of its legacy, a reminder that what happened inside those walls was so shocking that it permanently scarred the English language. The children of Bedlam, though unnamed, are part of that legacy. Their cries and stories linger behind the word, even if history rarely speaks their names. The fall of Bedlam closed one chapter but did not erase the suffering written within it. In the end, the decline and closure of Bedlam was less a triumph of compassion than a shifting of cultural tides. Public opinion turned, science advanced, and new institutions replaced the old. Yet the lesson of Bedlam is not that progress inevitably triumphs, but that cruelty can endure for centuries when cloaked in respectability. The asylum survived for nearly 600 years before its methods were seriously challenged. That endurance reveals how long societies can tolerate injustice when it is hidden behind walls and justified by authority. For the children who lived and died within its gates, Bedlam's fall came far too late. They were the invisible victims of an institution that outlasted their short lives. But their suffering remains the sharpest indictment of Bedlam's history. The asylum did not simply fail to heal, it devoured those who most needed protection. Its eventual decline may be remembered as a milestone of reform, but for those children, it was only a footnote to lives already lost in the shadows of stone walls and iron bars. The story of the children trapped in Bedlam in 1845 is more than a historical curiosity. It is a haunting reminder of what happens when a society decides that some lives are less valuable than others, when cruelty is disguised as science, and when silence is allowed to bury suffering. To reflect on their fate is to stare directly into the darkest corners of Victorian London, and, in doing so, to see uncomfortable parallels with our own world. The children of Bedlam were not merely victims of a single institution. They were casualties of a system that prized order over compassion, discipline over understanding, and progress for the powerful over protection for the powerless. Their stories still whisper across the centuries, demanding that we listen. What makes their suffering so chilling is the innocence of their condition. These were not hardened criminals or dangerous outcasts. They were children, fragile, voiceless, and dependent. Yet Victorian society cast them into one of the most notorious asylums in history, stripping them of identity and humanity. They became shadows in the public imagination, reduced to labels like idiot or imbecile, dismissed as incurable, and treated as curiosities for paying crowds. In the span of a single generation, hundreds of young lives were erased in silence. Their childhoods were not simply stolen. They were obliterated, replaced with chains, cold baths, and isolation. That such cruelty could be normalized reveals how deeply indifference can corrode the conscience of a society. And yet, this was not only a Victorian failure. It is a human failure, one that echoes in other times and other places. The institutional abuse of children has taken many forms throughout history. Orphanages where neglect and beatings were routine, schools where brutality masqueraded as discipline, and hospitals where experimentation replaced care. Bedlam may be gone, but the mindset that created it, the belief that vulnerable children can be silenced, hidden, or discarded, remains a threat. Modern scandals in foster systems, juvenile detention centers, and psychiatric facilities remind us that the line between past and present is thinner than we would like to admit. When we speak of the children of Bedlam, we are also speaking of children today who are still overlooked and abandoned by the institutions meant to protect them. The story also forces us to confront the danger of pseudoscience. In Bedlam, cruelty was justified by phrenology, humoral theory, and early hereditarian ideas. Doctors convinced themselves they were healing, even as they tortured. Parents believed they were acting responsibly, even as they abandoned their children. This perverse logic shows how easily human beings can commit atrocities when armed with false knowledge wrapped in the authority of science. The lesson is clear. Whenever science is divorced from compassion, whenever authority replaces empathy, the vulnerable suffer most. Today, with our advanced technologies and genetic sciences, the risk has not vanished. The temptation to define who is fit or unfit, who is worthy of care and who is expendable, still lurks in debates over medicine, disability, and poverty. Remembering the children of Bedlam also challenges us to think about silence. Their voices were rarely recorded, their names often lost, their existence buried in ledgers that reduced them to numbers. History did not preserve their words. It preserved the words of doctors, reformers, and visitors who looked at them from the outside. This imbalance means we must reconstruct their lives from fragments and imagine what they endured. In doing so, we accept the responsibility of speaking for those who were never allowed to speak for themselves. To forget them would be to repeat the injustice of their erasure. To remember them is to resist the silence that cruelty demands. Their legacy also compels us to redefine what it means to measure a society. Victorian London boasted of its railways, factories, and empire, yet it allowed children to rot in chains a few miles from Parliament. The grandeur of the age was built on a foundation of hidden suffering. If progress can coexist with such cruelty, then progress alone cannot be our measure of civilization. The true measure lies in how a society treats its most vulnerable, its children, its sick, its poor, its unwanted. By that standard, Bedlam was not an anomaly but a mirror held up to Victorian values, exposing their hypocrisy. The children's suffering is a reminder that cruelty often hides beneath the very structures that pride themselves on progress. And yet, within this bleak reflection, there is also resilience. The rare stories of children who resisted, who clung to scraps of play or whispered songs to themselves, reveal that even in the depths of cruelty, the human spirit struggles to endure. These fragments of resistance are precious because they remind us that the children of Bedlam were not passive victims. They were fighters, however small their acts of defiance might have seemed. To remember them is not only to grieve their suffering but also to honor their resilience. As the asylum's walls crumbled and its legacy transformed into legend, the children themselves were left behind, forgotten in graves without markers. But history allows us to retrieve them, to bring their stories back into the light. In telling their tale, we do not simply recount what happened, we challenge ourselves to prevent it from happening again. The children of Bedlam remind us that institutions can easily become prisons, that science can easily become cruelty, and that silence can easily become complicity. So, as we close the story of 1845 and the children trapped in Bedlam, we must ask ourselves, what lessons have we truly learned? Have we built systems that protect rather than discard? Do we see every child as worthy of compassion, regardless of poverty, illness, or difference? Or are there still walls, physical or invisible, where children are hidden away, their cries unheard? The answer to these questions will define not only how we remember the past but how we shape the future. The children of Bedlam cannot speak to us. Their voices were stifled by chains, their stories erased by time. But in the silence they left behind, there is a demand that still resonates. Remember us. Remember the cruelty we endured, the childhoods we lost, the humanity we were denied. And let that memory be not only an act of mourning but a call to vigilance. For as long as societies find it easier to hide their vulnerable than to care for them, the spirit of Bedlam endures. The children's legacy is not one of despair alone. It is a warning, a mirror, and a plea. To hear it is to recognize that history's darkest chapters are written not by monsters alone but by ordinary people who look away. To honor it is to commit to a different path, to build a world where no child is ever again treated as a burden to be hidden, but as a life to be cherished. Bedlam has fallen, but the responsibility it leaves us remains.